Welcome back to the second part of Lecture 9 on Stoicism. In this video, we'll start by looking at the Stoics' philosophical system as a whole, focusing particularly on how their views in physics, logic, and ethics interlock and support each other. This will provide some framing for a deeper understanding of Stoic thought. Next, we'll explore Stoic cosmopolitanism, an approach to interpersonal relations that emphasizes our affinity with all humanity. Lastly, building on some of the ideas we covered in the first part of this lecture, we'll discuss the features of Stoic activism. We'll see here how Stoicism advocates for active engagement in the world, guided by virtue and wisdom, rather than a fatalistic attitude. So let's get going. In the first part of this lecture, we considered two important quotes from Seneca that summarize the Stoic approach to living in harmony with nature, embracing virtue, and developing a resilient, compassionate mind. We came across a number of key terms here: nature, wisdom, mind, virtue, and our interactions with others. And we were left with some questions. How are these elements interconnected in Stoic philosophy? And how do they combine to form a coherent vision of the good life? Well, the Stoics were highly systematic in how they thought of philosophy. They were perhaps the most systematic philosophers in the ancient world. They divided philosophy, as was typical in the Hellenistic period, into three main branches: physics, logic, and ethics. Physics, for the Stoics, refers to the study of nature, from the Greek word physis. And since in the ancient world the study of nature also involved addressing metaphysical questions about the principles that underlie nature, the Stoics believed that to do physics properly, you also have to do metaphysics. In the broadest sense, physics on this view deals with the nature of the universe and our place within it. The Stoics saw logic generally as the study of reason, and in particular as the study of what makes us, as human beings, rational animals. This means that logic for the Stoics includes the process of making sound judgments. It thus encompasses the study of knowledge, and what we today call epistemology. Then there's the final branch of philosophy, ethics. And as with all philosophers in the Greek and Roman world, ethics here for the Stoics refers to the study of the good life, or human well-being, captured in the Greek notion of eudaimonia that we've come across repeatedly in this course. It's important to recognize this Stoic system because more than any other school in the Greek and Roman world, the Stoics saw these three branches of philosophy as fundamentally connected and forming an integrated whole. None of these branches stands on its own. Instead, each of them implies the other, and so they stand and fall together. You can imagine the Stoic system here then as composed of three long threads of string, bound up in a ball, where if you pull on any one string, the whole ball unravels. That's how tightly integrated the Stoic system is. Now, the Stoics used their own metaphors to make this point, assigning to each area of philosophy a certain role. They said we can think of philosophy as a whole using the image of an egg, where physics represents the yolk of the egg, logic represents the shell of the egg, and ethics represents the white of the egg. In this metaphor, physics represents the core of philosophy, and it plays a foundational role, like the yolk, while logic plays a structuring role in philosophy, like the shell, and ethics represents the goods of philosophy, the white of the egg, the most nutritious part, where we get our protein. The Stoics also used the metaphor of a fertile field to depict philosophy, with the grass and the soil of the field representing physics, the fence around the field representing logic, and the fruit of the field representing ethics. Again, we see physics playing a foundational role here. It's the very ground of philosophy in this metaphor. Logic has a structuring role like a fence, setting boundaries and parameters for what makes sense, while ethics bears the fruit, literally, of the field. Ethics is the fruit of philosophy. What we're going to do next is consider each of these branches of philosophy to see how the Stoics thought they hang together in explaining the nature of the good life. Zeno, the founder of the Stoic school, claimed a bit cryptically that the good life is living in agreement, a slogan that later Stoics spelt out further. The principal idea here is that to live well, we must live in agreement with nature, because nature, for the Stoics, is endowed with reason. The Stoics then expanded further on this idea by saying we should live in agreement with nature in two ways. First, in a way that expresses internal agreement with our own nature as human beings, the order inside of us. And second, we should live in a way that expresses external agreement with nature as a whole, the order outside of us, which includes other people. So that's a basic encapsulation of Stoic ethics. To live well, we should live in agreement with nature. Let's now explore how this slogan can be interpreted from the standpoint of the other two branches of Stoic philosophy, physics and logic. From the standpoint of physics, the yolk of the egg, or the ground of the field that composes the Stoic system, what does nature tell us is good for us? You might think nature tells us that pleasure is good. And in fact, we've seen how the Stoics' rival school in the Hellenistic period, Epicureanism, did make this claim. But even the Epicureans recognized that not all the things that we take pleasure in are good for us. Sometimes the things we find pleasant are actually bad for us. Nor is it the case that things like wealth and fame are always good for us. It often turns out that we use our wealth badly, and the pursuit of fame can lead to an unhealthy conception of ourselves where we base the goodness of our lives on the opinions of others. These are all things, pleasure, wealth, fame, that we conventionally regard as good for us. But what nature tells us is that these conventional goods can all sometimes be bad for us when used wrongly. There's only one thing, the Stoics claim, that benefits us always and unconditionally, and that's virtue. Virtue is the thing that makes a conventional good an actual good. Binge watching your favorite TV show till the early hours of the morning may give you pleasure, but when you watch moderately, you live better than if you watch immoderately. Similarly, when you use your wealth moderately or justly, you live better than if you use it immoderately or unjustly. And when you enjoy fame and status in society and hold on to your integrity, you live better than if you pursue fame and status at the cost of your integrity, and so on. This means that from the standpoint of physics, according to the Stoics, living in agreement with nature means living virtuously. What about from the standpoint of logic, or the study of reason, the shell of the egg, the fence of the field? Well, to follow nature and to live in agreement with the order outside of us, the Stoics claim we must attend to our sense impressions and respond to them wisely. Getting a good understanding of nature on this view requires that we always assent to impressions that are true, and never assent to impressions that are false. This is how the Stoics understand knowledge, a cognitive state of assenting to nature consistently and reliably. But this also means that knowledge is really hard. Our environments are structured in all sorts of ways so that they mess around with our perceptions. People can say all sorts of things that can be interpreted in the wrong way. When events don't go our way in the natural order of things, it's easy to get frustrated and respond badly. The Stoics agree that knowledge is really hard. However, they claim we should still try to get as close as possible to acting with knowledge by assenting as much as we can to impressions that are true. When it comes in particular to the question of what's truly good for us, as we've just seen, nature tells us that virtue is the only thing that benefits us. So assenting to impressions that are true means responding to the world virtuously. Now, the human power with which we deal with impressions is our mind, our reason, or our faculty of choice. Ultimately, we have the freedom to choose what we devote our attention to and what we dwell on. And this freedom to choose, the power we have to assent to impressions and to refrain from assenting to impressions, that's in fact the only thing under our direct control for the Stoics. So living according to nature from the standpoint of logic means attending to what's under our control. Finally, we can connect physics with logic by appealing to the figure of the Stoic sage. Knowledge for the Stoics is an aspirational state, a state we should seek to live in agreement with nature. And to flesh this out further, they set up an epistemic ideal, the sage. Such a hypothetical person would assent only to impressions that are true, and thus would possess genuine knowledge. Now, it's important to stress that knowledge here is not about knowing facts. It's not book learning or the consumption and regurgitation of information. Knowledge for the Stoics is the state of mind of the sage who responds well to impressions. This means the Stoic sage is most in tune with nature and the reason that pervades nature. It's important to stress also that this state is an ideal. The Stoics did not believe that anyone in their own time was a sage. They speculated that Socrates might have been a sage, but the best we can be, they held, are progressors, approaching the ideal of sagehood as best we can, though always imperfectly. We'll come back to this difference between the sage and the progressor later in this unit. But the important point for our purposes now is that the sage lives in full agreement with nature by using reason correctly to respond to impressions. And so the sage acts with knowledge. And that means that virtue for the Stoics is wisdom, which is the human capacity to respond well to impressions. It also makes the Stoics the most radical virtue ethicists we've come across in the ancient world. First, because they believe every virtue reduces to a kind of wisdom. And second, because they believe this is all we need ultimately to live well. Virtue, or wisdom, responding well to impressions, is sufficient to live a good life. Okay, so at this point we have an overall sense for the Stoics' understanding of the good life. With the foundations of their ethical theory now laid out, let's address some common criticisms of Stoicism. The first concerns the Stoics' political views. It might seem so far from what we've covered that Stoicism is a selfish philosophy and recommends a fair bit of navel-gazing in interpreting virtue as a state of mind that involves attending to impressions and focusing only on what you can control. But what about other people, particularly those in the world who are downtrodden and discriminated against, who are on the margins? Shouldn't virtue require that we attend to them too? Well, in fact, the Stoics were the first in the ancient world to develop what they themselves called a cosmopolitan worldview. The term comes from two Greek words, cosmos and polites, which when put together literally mean citizen of the world. And the Stoics again used an image to illustrate this view. The image is a series of concentric circles that gradually extend outward. Just as when you drop a pebble in water and it naturally forms a series of circles spreading further away, so too as a human being matures into a fully rational adult, their circles of affinity naturally extend outward. Our first circle of affinity, when we're still at an immature life stage, is to ourselves. But it soon happens, as we grow up in social units, that we develop wider circles of affinity, first to our immediate family, then to an extended family and our community, then to our particular tribe or country, until finally, on the outermost circle, we have humankind as a whole. Ultimately, the Stoics argued, the aim of living well and in complete agreement with nature is to collapse all of these circles of affinity into a single point, so that we treat anyone who lives in the outermost circle just as we would those in the inner circles. It's as a result of this cosmopolitan view that the Stoics were also among the first in antiquity to develop arguments against slavery. The thought here is that there's no meaningful difference between the nature that the most elite person in society possesses and the nature possessed by those who are the most subjugated in society. Every human being, no matter their class, gender, culture, or upbringing, has the same basic nature in possessing the same power of reason and rational choice. And so all human beings deserve our equal care and concern. As Seneca puts it, wherever there is a human being, there exists an opportunity for an act of kindness. At this point, we can return to our two Seneca quotes from earlier and reread them to see why he draws such a close connection between nature, wisdom, mind, virtue, and other people. By surveying the Stoics' views on physics, logic, and ethics, we've seen how these elements intertwine to form a coherent and comprehensive vision of the good life. By understanding the overlap between these elements, with nature at the center, we can see how Stoicism guides us not only to individual well-being, but also to a life of ethical and political engagement with the world. This is the Stoic path to eudaimonia, a life that requires a wise engagement with our impressions, a commitment to the common good of humanity, and living in rational harmony with nature. To conclude this lecture, let's consider one more common objection that people raise against Stoicism. In emphasizing a life living in harmony with nature and focusing only on what's under our control, it may seem that the Stoics encourage an excessively passive outlook. But in fact, nothing could be further from the truth. Historically in the ancient world, the Stoics were among the most activist of philosophers. More than any other school, they advised that we engage vigorously in public life and politics. But how did the Stoics combine this activist attitude with the idea that we should focus only on what's under our control? Well, at the heart of the Stoic approach to the good life is the idea that we should focus on efforts rather than outcomes. It's quite compatible with this to say that we should seek to improve how our lives are going, and to do what we can to make the world a better place, whatever it is that lies under our control, by bringing about social change. Again, the Stoics' cosmopolitan view requires that we direct our efforts in this direction. But what the Stoics go on to say is that we should form this activist attitude with reservation. We should act in such a way that our efforts always include a reserve clause, something like, I'll achieve this as long as nothing prevents me from doing so. And if something does prevent us from achieving a certain outcome, we should be able to carry on in some way, either by adjusting our efforts or adapting ourselves to the new situation, converting the obstacle into an opportunity to act differently. Stoicism thus teaches a form of activism that's both flexible and persistent, emphasizing that while we should strive for ethical and political growth and improvement, we should also be prepared to adjust our actions in response to changing circumstances. It's a philosophy that combines the determination to act with the wisdom to accept. There are many places in the Stoics' writings where we see this idea emphasized. Consider this quote from Seneca. The happy life, he says, is the one that's in harmony with its own nature, and the only way it can be achieved is if, first, the mind is sound and constantly in possession of its sanity, and secondly, if it is brave and vigorous, and in addition capable of the noblest endurance, adapting to every new situation, attentive to the body and to all that affects it, but not in an anxious way. And finally, if it concerns itself with all the things that enhance life, without showing undue respect for any of them, taking advantage of fortune's gifts, but not becoming their slave. Seneca describes the essence of the Stoic life in this quote, an attitude of mental soundness, resilience, and adaptability. It's an attitude that requires we engage with life's challenges vigorously, yet with a sense of calm endurance, ready to adapt as situations evolve. For another expression of this same idea, consider this passage from Marcus Aurelius' Meditations. The ruling power within us, when it is in line with nature, takes up a stance towards events that enables it always to adapt easily to what is presented to it. It is not attached to any specific material, but aims at achieving its objectives with reservation. When it comes up against an obstacle, it converts this into material for itself, like fire, when this masters the things that fall into it. A small lamp would have been extinguished by them, but a blazing fire quickly appropriates the things thrown into it and consumes them, and uses those very things to grow still higher. Like the fire that converts what's thrown into it into fuel, the advice here is to use our minds to see obstacles as opportunities. We should aim at achieving certain objectives, but always with the reserve clause that things might not turn out in the way that we want. And if they don't, we should learn from our setbacks and respond by expressing another virtue that allows us to carry on, maybe patience or determination, depending on the situation. Recall finally our comparison of these two quotes from Reinhold Niebuhr and Angela Davis at the start of this unit. Despite seeming to say opposite things, we pointed out how they can be read as making equivalent claims. Niebuhr's prayer focuses on serenity to accept what cannot be changed, which aligns with the Stoic acceptance of the natural order of things. On the other hand, Davis's statement emphasizes our capacity to act, resonating with the Stoic principle of willful engagement and effort. This juxtaposition nicely expresses the Stoic balance that we've been examining, a balance that involves accepting the realities we cannot change, while actively working to change what's within our power to address. It's not a dichotomy, but a dynamic interplay between acceptance and action that the Stoics recommend. In this part of Lecture 9, we've taken a close look at the Stoic system by discussing how Stoicism integrates physics, logic, and ethics into a holistic approach to life. This system provides a framework for living in agreement with nature, a central principle of Stoic philosophy. We've also examined Stoic cosmopolitanism, a perspective on our relations with others that asks us to expand our care and concern to all of humanity. By rereading Seneca's thoughts on the happy life, we've gained a richer understanding of how the Stoics viewed happiness, or eudaimonia, not as a pursuit of external goods like wealth and fame, but as a cognitive state, a mental outlook achieved by attending to what's under our control. And finally, we tackled the topic of Stoic activism. Far from endorsing a passive approach to life, Stoicism encourages an attitude of active engagement, asking us to focus our efforts on what we can control and adapting to what we cannot, always with a view toward improving ourselves and the world around us. In the next lecture, our last for this unit, we'll expand further on these themes before taking a look at the influence of ancient Stoicism in our contemporary world and in its practical applications for our modern lives. This will also tie in with the exercises you'll complete next week as you seek to live like a Stoic.